Welcome to the Western Standards Pipeline, our weekly public affairs broadcast. I'm publisher of the Western Standard, Derek Fildebrandt. Joining me today is Western Standard news editor Dave Naylor. Good day, Dave.
Hello, Derek.
And Western Standard podcast editor and columnist extraordinaire Cory Morgan. How you doing?
Good.
Well, today we're going to be going through a number of issues. The main one you see on the banner is the anti-lockdown protests erupting across Canada and the record federal deficit approaching $1 trillion. But we'll also be diving into how this is broken down across the West, particularly comments made by Alberta Premier Jason Kenney as it relates to COVID in the South Asian community. And the Calgary City Council, bizarrely, trying to put in place new rules that would restrict any sitting city councilors who are running for mayor from campaigning in how many councilors are there?
14.
From campaigning in 13 out of 14 wards in the city, making it pretty much impossible unless you're only campaigning by Facebook. So interesting things coming to us today. We're going to begin with the anti-lockdown protests erupting across Canada. They've come hard and fast here. Many of the mainstream media are outraged, absolutely outraged, that these are not BLM protests. I think that's what the outrage is about, right? Yeah. Well, Dave, why don't you run us through what we've been seeing with these anti-lockdown protests, the different forms they've been taking, not just the gatherings. We'll talk about the gatherings. We could talk about, Ontario MPP Randy Hillier, his arrest. Talk about businesses refusing to close down, and then, of course, protests that are not BLM taking place across Canada, particularly here in the West. Why don't you run us through?
Sure. Well, in Calgary on the weekend, there were 2 days of protests on Saturday and Sunday down at the Municipal Plaza, which saw hundreds and hundreds of people gather without masks to protest the crackdown. Rallies also took place across the West, including Edmonton and Red Deer. Interestingly, though, Derek, police were on hand, and even though the Justice Minister Madu the day before deputized 700 bylaw officers to start handing out tickets, not a single ticket was given out. Not a single warning was given. Police just stood by and watched. I find it strange, going back way back to the days when Calgary hosted the G8 summit. Calgary police were set to arrest hundreds and hundreds of people at a time. They had mobile protest centers set up, they had buses set up. So they've been through this mass protest stuff before, yet they didn't make a single arrest. Police say they're still investigating, they took video everybody, and people may expect to get tickets in the mail. Other people are outraged. They say they should have been all ticketed and fined. And this sort of stuff is going on now across Canada. You see the big barbecue protest in Etobicoke, where Adam Skelly, a barbecue joint owner, was hauled away in handcuffs and charged with breaking their public health act by breaking into his already locked restaurant and reopening it again. Apparently they serve some of the best ribs in the Toronto area.
That mustard.
Yeah, so he had to spend the night in jail. So quickly the 2020 thing to do is set up a GoFundMe to pay for his legal bills, and he's going to be able to hire some pretty good lawyers, because I think last time I checked, it was sitting at over $200,000 money raised. So it's Alberta's had more than 10, 11 straight days of numbers over 1,000 people. Both sides seem to be digging in for a fight. So it's going to be interesting to see where the authorities take it from here.
Yeah. In Calgary, there were no arrests made, although, and when we're comparing to some other ones before, I think police were arresting violent rioters in most cases, people who are attacking police or trying to destroy property. It's pretty bad press, I think, for police to arrest people who are protesting government doing something to them. I think masks are, probably a lot less useful than the government's now saying. They said they were entirely not useful. It's probably somewhere in the middle. But people are protesting against their businesses being closed. They're protesting against not being allowed to have people into your own private homes. I've never heard of the government ever restricting that you can't have people in your own home on your private property. These were passive protesters. They weren't rioting. They weren't destroying property. They weren't asking actually for anything. They were asking the government not to do something. So it would look pretty bad. It would be a pretty bad look, I think, for the government to start throwing these people in jail.
But technically, they're breaking the law.
They are.
You are not allowed to have an outside demonstration or an outside gathering of more than 10 people.
Yeah. Oh, I think their point was quite deliberate, though. They intentionally broke the law. They weren't doing it passively. They were intentionally breaking it because they don't believe that should be the law. Because that law was never passed by a legislature. It was decreed by the cabinet without any debate in the legislature, without any debate in the public. It was just done. So yeah, it is breaking the law. But I think I would put this in the same category as how many people would view marijuana prohibition until very recently. Yeah, I think it's the law, but it shouldn't be against the law. So I'm going to do it anyway. But I suppose there are a number of people who think that even the bad laws should be followed. I'm not necessarily in that category, but people have different views on it. Cory, do you think the reason there haven't, at least in Alberta, been what we've seen in, say, Ontario, where the Ford government has been just positively gleeful to just hammer people for any disobeying of the government's I won't call them laws here because they weren't actually passed by the legislature. I'll call them cabinet orders, orders in council technically. Why do you think we haven't seen the same level of crackdown, both in terms of I think Alberta does have a lockdown. It's just not as extreme as the one before, and it's not as extreme as we see in some other provinces like Ontario. So kind of two questions. Why do you think Alberta's not had as extreme a lockdown as other provinces? And secondly, why do you think there hasn't been, say, arrests of people at these protests?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it's just the attitude of the premier in each province. I mean, there's something, I think, to a degree with people who are inherently very much more concerned or even afraid of the virus versus those who aren't. And it's clear Doug Ford is terrified of this thing. I mean, he right from the bat of the whole pandemic, he's been very strong on enforcement and pushing and trying to clamp down on this. I mean, we could call it almost an individual ideology. It's not right or left. It's just how people feel about that virus. Whereas Jason Kenney's been more reticent. It's almost reluctantly bringing in restrictions. And they still are restrictions coming in. But the feel going out to Albertans, at least, is that he's a little bit on your side, at least the ones who don't feel we should have more restrictions. Like he's cornered, he's forced to do it. So you're not getting that broader range of the public feeling that they've been cracked down on. I went down to the Calgary demonstration on Saturday for a little while. And there were a few hundred people there. There's a few things I observed. I mean, for one, we want to talk about double standards too. I mean, we had the same people who were saying we should leave protesters who block rail lines alone, and we shouldn't have the police wade into potentially dangerous situations. And these are people saying that police should have waded into 500 people and start ticketing and trying to break up the crowd, which could take a very peaceful situation and potentially turn.
Well, they should have just had the anti-lockdown protest on the rail line a few hundred meters away.
But the politics do show that, the differences in enforcement or who's calling for what. We've seen some double standards from a number of people. And as you said, that group was very peaceful. These people weren't bothered. There was a large police presence, but they stayed around the periphery. What I didn't see a lot of was mainstream people in the protest, I guess to say it, to be polite. I met a lot of crazy people down there. There were people who said they were going to chip us with vaccines and control our minds, and there were lizard people controlling the world. There were just people protesting everything from Trump again to, it was just very disparate. It was just malcontents in general getting together in one spot. There were a lot of genuinely concerned people who came out too, who were concerned about the lockdowns, about the mass legislation. But I think almost once they got to the core of that group, they got a little put off and they just kind of wandered back home. If we get larger lockdowns that impact people more directly in Alberta, I think we'll see more of those mainstream people getting off their butts and saying, we got to push back. That's enough. If we see the optics of things like that business owner in Ontario dragged out of his business like that physically, if we do actually start getting examples of neighbors calling because we had Uncle Phil over for a drink one night, then we're going to start seeing bigger protests. But also what could bring about bigger protests is had the police marched into that crowd and really started hammering down on these people, then that is what's going to bring out more people. That's not going to calm it. That's going to inflame it.
We see guys like Don Braid of the Calgary Herald, who said that all the COVID deaths that take place, if there's no lockdown now, will be I think I'm giving the exact quote. I could be wrong, but saying was, we'd be blood on Kenney's hands, essentially accusing him of murder, or at least public manslaughter, if we can coin a term. But, they're calling for just mass arrests of these people. I think Kenney is smart enough to know if you do that in Alberta, with the way Albertans are, you're going to make it a lot worse. I'm not going down to it because I know it's going to have. I largely agree with the broad reason that they were there, but I know it's going to have a bunch of disparate conspiracy theorists and people who think it's all a hoax or something. But as soon as you start, sending 100 cops on horseback to raid a barbecue joint, haul the guy out, arrest him, I think the reaction in Alberta would be terrible towards the government.
And we'll push back.
Yeah, people will push back. People in Ontario are pushing back against this because it's harder. But I think the character of Albertans would be pushing back even harder, and you would see even less compliance. Right now, I think you got roughly half of Albertans who comply because they think it's necessary and proper. You've got probably a quarter who think it's all bullshit and they're not complying whatsoever. And then there's probably the fourth quarter there, another 25% roughly, who would they think it's maybe overblown. They think this is draconian. They think this is all just kind of political posturing on the part of the government, but they don't want a lot of trouble, so they'll just comply anyway. I'm somewhere in between those two other quarters. Well, yeah, and I think a lot of people are. But if you start, if I saw a barbecue joint owner here hauled out and arrested for trying to make a living and not lose his home and lose his business, you know what? I'll be out there too.
Well, I've said before, I kind of got a lot of people wound up with me. There's some very dedicated anti-vaccination folks out there, whatever. But when it comes to a vaccine coming out, I'm in that line of, I'll wait my turn. I'm not highly vulnerable. I imagine it'll take a while to get to me. But when the time comes, I'll get vaccinated, if you ask. If you legislate me to get vaccinated, you tell me, you put a gun to my head, now we're going to have a problem. Yeah. And now I'm going to get my back up, and now I might actually, just on a point of principle, not get vaccinated. You got to watch that nuanced approach with people. Treat us like adults. Work with us. The majority of us will do what's best for the problem.
Well, yeah, you're seeing this from a lot broadly on the left. The NDP have been careful not to go into 100% mandatory vaccine territory, but they generally fall into the territory of, fine, we won't pin you down and vaccinate you, but if you don't have a vaccine, you're not allowed to leave your house, kind of thing. The NDP are known for their strong pro-choice, my body, my choice philosophy, which applies to things beyond abortion, surely. But I think a lot of people, myself included, will be where you are. I'm broadly pro-vaccination. They're not all perfect. Some of them can go wrong, like anything in medicine. But I would like to have a vaccination once it's available, and once it gets to someone, I'd be a pretty low priority. But when it gets to me, I have every intention of taking it. But as soon as the government says you have to take it, or if you don't take, or a form of mandatory vaccination, which would be, we're not going to pin you down, but if you don't take it, you're not allowed to leave your house or something. If you do that, I'm not going to take it on principle. I want to take it. I'm pro-vaccination. I know some of our viewers are probably going to disagree with me on that, but that's your choice. But as soon as the government takes away my choice, I feel obligated to do the opposite.
That's it.
It may not be government that's going to make the choice for you. I think what the future is going to see is places like Ticketmaster have already said, you're not getting a ticket unless you can show you've been vaccinated.
But that's private.
And airlines are not going to let you fly. And so they may be sort of forcing people that way to get yourself vaccinated.
I could see some court challenges coming up with that, because that's asking for personal medical information. Though again, I mean, it could turn into quite a battle. But I do see what you're saying, absolutely, with what private companies can start.
I think it's too far if a private company does that, asking for your vaccination records. They might just make it as simple as, like, click this box, and maybe it's that. But there's a difference between when private does something and when government does something. I'm a bit of a radical in that I think you should be allowed to deny service. If you're a business, you should be allowed to deny service to anybody for any reason, including bad reasons. Yeah. I know that's not a popular position, but you should be allowed to deny service for someone because you don't like gingers. You don't like gingers, they can't come in. And of course, very bad things can happen with that. But the public can punish a business by boycotting it, by calling it out, but they should have a right to do it. And if they don't want to serve someone who's not vaccinated, I think they should have a right to do it. But it's very different when the government is doing something, because you don't have a choice to use the government. If you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. You go to prison. Men with guns come to your house. You're forced to participate in government. So I think there's a big difference between governments mandating vaccination or semi-mandating it and private businesses or homes.
The other interesting angle this week, gentlemen, is the finger pointing that has started to go towards northeast Calgary. They're the hotbed of COVID cases in the city, and Premier Kenney took to the airwaves this week they went on an ethnic radio station, and he basically told the Southeast Asian community to smarten up and start following the rules. He noted that the Southeast Asian community in Northeast Calgary only make up 11% of the population, but they're accounting for 20% of the cases. So it's the first time I think we've had somebody point their fingers at an ethnic community for spreading the virus. Caused immediate backlash, of course, and Kenney being called every racist name under the book. But it's a different twist on something that a single community is now being singled out.
I was surprised to see it. I mean, it is based on the data. I was on Ryan Jesperson's kind of independent radio program earlier in the week, Monday, or maybe it was late last week. And there was someone on, she used the word intersectional about twice every sentence, but she was going on about the need for race-based data in COVID and whatnot. I'm like, well, this is the race-based data you wanted, isn't it? Like, it's not just going to show things that support some strange academic intersectional argument. It's going to show different groups are going to have different rates of infection. Some of it might not be very politically correct to say. Some of it can be used for racist arguments. I mean, I'm sure racists will point to some of this data and say, hey, look at those people. I'm sure there will be some of that, but it's not necessarily racist to point to raw facts. I was surprised to see Jason Kenney do it. I mean, he's spent most of his political career harvesting ethnic votes for Stephen Harper, so he knows how to deal with this stuff. He's actually pretty strong with the South Asian community. Well, at least he has been. It started to break down the lead up to the last election. There was a lot of controversy around there, but I thought it was brave, actually. I thought it was correct, if not impolitic. He did it on Red FM with Rishi Nagar, he was actually a Wildrose constituency president. He's definitely on the right side of the South Asian community in Calgary. It was an odd move, and the media are now calling him out for it. But many of the media calling him out for singling out, fairly or unfairly, the South Asian community. They're calling out churches. I mean, like Manitoba, we just had a church that was going to have an outdoor drive-in service, and the cops blocked it. I think they even arrested people. It was wild stuff. So it's okay to pick on Christians. It's not okay to pick on others. No. Everyone's fair to be picked on.
New York hasn't hesitated to pick on Jews. We're having
De Blasio. Although that was a huge gathering.
Yes.
They practically filled a stadium. I mean, and I'm on the anti-lockdown side, but even I was like, come on, guys, that was a bit much. They pretty much filled a stadium for a giant Orthodox wedding.
It's become almost politically trendy, though, to scold from the leader's pulpit, not just Kenney telling people to knock it off, or Ford telling people, or Trudeau telling people, taking that strong stance of wagging the finger. That always gets on my nerves. I don't care which leader.
Well, people are looking right now, that like what we're seeing right now, I think, is the desire. Everybody says, oh, if I was around the 1930s, I would be against the fascists. But what you're seeing now is actually most people have, at least to some degree, a desire for the paternalistic father figure, the strong man of government. Ford's popularity went through the roof when he was the strong man commanding things and scolding people.
And that's it. But it was a poor choice to use that strategy and term when you were talking about a specific ethnic community, because it could be spun and taken in just the way it was spun and taken by people who don't like him. Like, if I go a bit further, so since then, I talked to a friend of mine that was ideal to talk to about this, Dr. Animal Kapoor. He's a cardiologist in Calgary. He's very involved, of course, with the South Asian community. He runs an annual thing called Dill Walk, which is regarding heart disease and diabetes, which is actually much higher in the South Asian community as well, due to dietary, that Indian food's fantastic, but it's not really great for your heart and veins. So he can speak directly, look, because there's a lot of communication challenges. There's differences. I mean, it's got some very different cultural values and beliefs. And I asked him about it. And part of what Dr. Kapoor said was, well, yeah, he said, Jason could have used a different set of words to get that point across. But there is a real issue going on. We have a community where it has an outsized amount of infections going on. So how do we target that community? You do got to worry about the racist saying we'll target it by building a wall around the Northeast. Okay, no, that's not an appropriate approach to take. But he said some interesting things. He said, like in the Punjabi region of India, it's huge over there for them to say, I guess the word that they're calling home to friends and family over here, saying the pandemic's over. You don't have to do anything. Everything else is just a hoax. Don't do it. Like it's a cultural thing, a rumor going through the community, which is stronger there, and it's keeping them from socially distancing. Or he said as well, poorly communicated things with mask use. It's difficult for Sikh men because they have that large beard going on. They have the other things, but they were also...
I can tell you, I don't have exactly a Sikh level beard, but the modest beard I've got, it's hard for me to wear a mask. Yeah. It's
there's challenges that are more unique to that community. They're new Canadians. They tend to live in more tightly packed households. They need there's language challenges sometimes. So sure, Dr. Hinshaw is pointing out a lot of great things, and some Omni and some of the other channels are reaching out as well. But it takes it's more outreach is required for these communities, and they're often people who work multiple jobs, and in the front line, they're driving taxis, they're running storefronts. Some of them are small business owners. They don't have somebody to come in while they self-isolate.
Well, the South Asian community, particularly in Alberta, but I think across Canada, and in like many immigrant populations, they have public-facing jobs. These are not jobs, like comfortable white liberals who can almost universally work from home.
Exactly.
They have to go to their store. They have to go to the garage. They've got to go to the convenience store. They got to go to the Tim Hortons, wherever they are. They have to work with people. They often have large families living in a single household, sometimes multiple families. And I've got pretty strong connections with the Northeast myself. We just went through Diwali. And if anybody thinks that Diwali just didn't take place this year, you're kidding yourself. Yeah. And I don't blame them. Christmas is coming up. I'm not going to not have Christmas. I'm going to have a limited Christmas. I'm going to have a cautious Christmas. I'm not having Christmas. So anybody who believes that Diwali just went away is kidding themselves.
So the bottom line in the end is there are special cultural considerations to take into place. So let's see how we can rationally approach it. That's one thing Dr. Kapoor offered, said if Kenny wants somebody for outreach to talk to the community about these things, he said he'd be more than happy to work further on that, just because there are special different things. In the early part of the pandemic, we saw the Filipino community got hit very hard in the meatpacking plants and very similar conditions because you have new Canadians, limited English, tight households, multiple jobs. So Jason Kenney was talking about something we're targeting. He just came at it in a terrible way.
Which is surprising for him because he's so used to dealing with ethnic. He is the master of ethnic politics in Canada. He is the guy. He's written the modern book on it.
Everybody blows it now and then, I guess.
I suppose so.
Kenny's scheduled to appear with Dr. Hinshaw later on Wednesday afternoon. It would be his first attempting at the press conference since the new regulations, I guess. And it's going to be interesting. Are we going to get our final warning or new limitations? Stay tuned.
You never go full lockdown. Well, let's move on to other distressing news. In Ottawa, we were looking up pictures actually of the debt clock. I was going to use one. The main one that came up was actually when I parked the debt clock in front of Parliament Hill, circa 2010, maybe 11. It was 500 something billion. The picture we're showing you now. Debt clock sits at 628 billion, but that picture has gone out of style very fast. That's a pretty modern. That's a pretty recent picture. Actually, I think it might be just last year. The debt now is about to hit $1 trillion for the first time in Canadian history. It will have nearly doubled in the span of less than 2 years here. An already sizable federal debt. A deficit that had literally an infinite projection of never balancing, like the American federal deficit, an infinite projection of continued deficits, not even a theoretical balanced budget date. We're now looking at a deficit of well north of $300 billion, which is, I stopped voting Conservative for a deficit of $30 billion. I still won't vote for anyone who runs a deficit of $30 billion, but holy hell, $300 billion. you can't understand it. That's the GDP of some countries in a single year that we're borrowing. Dave, why don't you run us through the fiscal update that the federal government put out and the numbers we're looking at?
Well, deficit, Derek's actually $381 billion.
Holy hell, that's closer to 400.
Well north of 300 billion. And that debt clock you showed at 600 million is going to double. It is now expected to hit 1.2 trillion. That's a lot of zeros, I think, Corey. I don't know how many, but that's 12 and a lot of zeros. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland did her economic update this week in the House of Commons, announced the record deficit, obviously mainly new COVID programs and support for Canadians there. She also announced another 100 billion of new incentives, and a lot of it is going to be for new green technology, converting gas stations into electronic charging stations, all that sort of good stuff. So not really a lot in there that's going to excite the average Albertan, but yeah.
Oh, we got $1 trillion. We got $1 billion.
Yes, not quite what Kenny asked for. Apparently, we're going to get a check for $1 billion through, is it stabilization or equalization?
Fiscal stabilization, which Kenny has kind of, I think, very incorrectly nicknamed or renamed the equalization rebate, which it is not. Kenny has more or less given up on any serious attempt at equalization reform, knowing that there's just no chance to get it. The federal Conservatives don't even support equalization reform. So do we expect Justin Trudeau's Liberals? No. So then he's kind of fallen back on this kind of equalization rebate. He is correct in saying, according to the rules, before the Liberals unilaterally changed it, right as Alberta needed it, we would be entitled to a payout of $6 billion plus. We've got pennies on the dollar of that even. So, decades of fighting against equalization, and we get a one-time check for $1 billion. That was worth the political capital.
Oh, yeah.
These are terrifying numbers. Justin would not be a Trudeau unless he managed to saddle at least 3 subsequent generations with unpayable debts. We are still paying off the debt. We're still paying interest on the debts from Pierre Trudeau. We're still using the fighter jets from that era too, but we are still paying off the debts of Pierre Trudeau. And before those are paid off, Justin Trudeau is now taking on the largest explosion of federal debt by far in Canadian history. By my calculations, Justin Trudeau has borrowed in a single year, adjusted for inflation, more money than the federal government borrowed to fight both the First and Second World Wars. In a single year. I understand revenues are going to drop off. There's probably going to be new programs. But the scale of this is unconscionable. It's, the government was already borrowing through the wazoo before. It didn't even have a projection before this happened. The federal government had no projection to even get to a balanced budget. Eventually, it was just had infinite projections for deficits. And then this happened. But of course, when this all passes, I'm sure we're going to need to continue spending in the name of stimulus. Cory, do you think there is, what do you think is going to be the political fallout of this? Do you think there's going to be any kind of political price to pay for the Liberals for borrowing? And do you think there's any prospect of the Conservatives under Aaron O'Toole being willing to completely shut off the taps and get back to a balanced budget here?
I wish there was going to be bigger political fallout. I don't think your average person understands the scope of just what's happening and what's coming down the road. I mean, we're going into this bizarre year of misery for all of us, economically, personally, and everybody, that mindset and attitude of government has to do something. It's the government's role to save us. So they're letting it slide with this borrowing. They're not thinking about that it's borrowing. They honestly aren't. I think people aren't realizing that this is a looming freight train of misery that's going to be coming, and it's unavoidable. I forget who put it the right way, but the reason that the Bev Otis orange juice incident was more damaging to a government than any billion or $1 trillion episode is because we can't wrap our minds around how huge that number is. Like when you think of a billion, an analogy I like using just for a billion, is $1 million if you stacked up $1,000 bills. We've never seen it, but if you did it, would be about 6 inches tall. $1 billion would be 500 feet tall. Now, $1 trillion is 1,000 times that. Like these numbers, we can't catch up on that debt. We can't. So we're going to see a currency correction or something. There's going to be inflation or like something is going to have to bring that back into check eventually, and we're going to all pay a price for it. But as far as the near-term future for Justin's political futures or anything O'Toole can do, I don't know what he can do to head that off. It's just dorks like us who look at the long-term numbers.
When I was at the Taxpayers Federation, we long before I was there, but it was rebuilt in my time there, is we brought back the debt clock. Because it was at least the closest thing we had to help people wrap their mind around it, that they could see it physically, they could see it ticking up in real time. Even then, it's hard for people to wrap their minds around. But now it's moving so fast that even I, like who I've made a career out of trying to help people understand and address deficits, it's beyond even my comprehension. And I'm going to get some numbers on this soon. But did you know that more than half of the Canadian dollars in circulation today, both printed and unprinted, were printed in the last year? We have inflated our currency by 100% in the last year. Now, that's going to hit at some point. Inflation can take a while to work its way through the system, especially when it's not cash printing, when it's not a physical printing press, but when the government just creates it on a balance sheet and releases it through the Bank of Canada into the main chartered banks. That's going to work its way through the system. The charter banks love inflation. It's free money for them. They get the money when it's still worth something, and they get to loan it out to people when it's worth less. It's the greatest racket in history is when government creates fiat money. The United States government has massively inflated its currency through the Federal Reserve. Central banks across the world have done this, but Canada, if I'm not mistaken, has inflated its currency by a massive margin, more than any other comparable advanced industrialized country on the planet. We are looking at serious inflation coming here, and people don't, unless you get to hyperinflation where you're taking wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread, people don't tend to blame the government. It's a way for government to spend freely without political consequence. Governments on the left and the right like to do it because they get to spend the money that people like without taxing people that they don't like. So there are going to be big consequences coming down the line right now, and no one seems to care about it. The federal Conservatives, even before COVID, said they weren't even going to balance the budget within one term. Now it is virtually impossible. So we have in Parliament not a single party that's committed to actually balancing the budget. Not a single party and I actually have to blame Stephen Harper for this. Stephen Harper. We had the financial crisis of 2008, and then they did all this other stuff. The government was going to run a deficit. He had already significantly increased spending in the years preceding it, and then the financial meltdown tipped it over. It was going to run a deficit. But they didn't just run a deficit saying this is crappy, we have to do it, but I'm going to get out of it right away. He, in the face of the whole coalition that formed against him, he just essentially took their program of stimulus and bailouts, this Keynesian kind of idea, and he ran with it and adopted it as his own and said deficits are not just unfortunate, they are necessary. And I don't think they understood at the time, but what they were doing is they broke the consensus in Canada that had developed across all major political parties beginning in the late 80s, that deficits are wrong regardless of if you're on the left or the right. And then Stephen Harper went for, he comes up against Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau says, I'm going to run a deficit. Well, Stephen Harper's argument essentially boiled down to, well, deficits are bad when you do it, but they're not bad when I do it. And that doesn't mean anything. That's just pure political calculus. And yeah, Stephen Harper almost certainly would run smaller deficits than Justin Trudeau. But once you're breaking the seal, once you've had too many beers and you break that seal, it's open and it's out. And I don't think the public makes much of a distinction between a $1 billion deficit and a $100 billion deficit. If it's a deficit or it's a surplus, and the people generally don't give much damn about any nuance in between. So unfortunately, it boils down to, are you a surplus party or are you a deficit party? And there's little in between.
I don't think I'm going to worry about going to overdraft in each month anymore. The government's not concerned.
Those consequences.
Why should I be panicked?
Those consequences do apply to you, unfortunately.
Oh, damn.
Okay, well, let's move on closer to home here. Calgary City Council proposing and voting on some very bizarre set of rules here that would seem to have quite an explicitly political agenda, even if they deny it. Dave, why don't you tee it up?
This is actually a bylaw, Derek, that came in 2016 prior to the last election. It basically says they do not want councillors going into other councillors' areas to hold political events unless you get permission from the sitting councillor in that ward. It was brought forward again this week by administration to a council committee where it was voted down 6-4, but it still goes ahead to the full council on Monday. And I think what this will do, Derek, is basically hobble any attempts by Jeromy Farkas to run for mayor. He is council's whipping boy. They absolutely hate him. They do not get along with him. And I think the feeling is completely mutual. So the thought of him having to go to Ward Sutherland and say, hey, can I hold a rally in your neck of the woods? I think we would all guess what the answer would be. So Cory actually broke the story, and it's going to be interesting to see on Monday what comes out of it.
It's a funny bylaw they're proposing. It only applies to councillors because the mayor doesn't have a ward. He's all over the city. So if Nenshi were to run for re-election, Nenshi would certainly not be required. He wouldn't have to ask permission of Jeromy Farkas to campaign in his ward, Ward 6, or I'm not sure which it is.
6.
But wherever that is, Mayor Nenshi wouldn't need the permission of Jeromy Farkas to go to his ward, but Jeromy Farkas would need the permission of 13 other councillors to get the permission to go to any one of theirs, making it virtually impossible to campaign if he respects the bylaw. As I said before, some laws are meant to be broken, and if the council does break this, I think Jeromy Farkas would be well advised to raise a GoFundMe campaign and challenge this as unconstitutional. Exactly. I think it would be unconstitutional. Cory, so this went to the council's committee, not to the full council yet, and it was defeated. But I get the feeling that not everybody voted as they really wanted to vote. Why don't you tell us why you think this failed in committee and what might be the outcome as it goes to the full council? When does it go to full council?
Monday, when
it goes to the full council.
Yeah, I think it might be December 14th. But yeah, it's coming again before full council. A little background on it too. So actually it's a code of conduct policy. So it's kind of the inner city thing, but which makes it even more nebulous though, because then a councillor who's been accused of breaking it can be dragged before the integrity commissioner, and then we're starting to get more Kafkaesque with these.
Well, then you get a scolding letter for being unethical or something to break it.
But then they can do some other things, because we've seen Jeromy Farkas kicked out of council meetings. We've seen him shut out of doing his job and being public. They can really make an unholy mess for him through this, and your defense is difficult when it's an internal document like this. This was actually modeled. What they did was they dredged up an old one that had expired, and it was targeted at Sean Chu, who prior to Jeromy Farkas was the most hated man on council by the mayor and some of the others, because Ward 4 had boundary changes. And Sean was trying to campaign in what would be Ward 4 in the next election, but that meant he was campaigning in another councillor's ward at that time. So they built this policy to handicap Sean in his campaigning. So they dredged it up and realized this is more effective for a sitting councillor mayoral candidate than it ever was for Chu. So let's adjust it a little bit and bring it back up and throw it through. And I think what happened though was, now again, see, they love saying, oh, this wasn't us, it was administration. Oh, come on. The administration's got a purple hand on the back of its neck that tells it what to do. And these things come from there. And what a great advantage it gives that incumbent mayor. The problem was it broke before it hit the floor. What would have been a sleepy, quiet council meeting or a committee meeting where they could just shuffle this little document through. Unfortunately, it hit some news. Some jerky columnist wrote a piece and called out Ward Sutherland as an individual who would probably use such a thing as a tool to hinder a certain other council member he didn't like. And it was. I found it humorous almost listening to the live discussion of it, because Sutherland was talking in committee saying, well, this has been turned into a political tool now, that could have been good, but I'm forced to just say we should not have it go through. Grudgingly voted against it, apparently.
It's a good Sutherland impression.
Yeah. I won't go there. But either way, it's coming before the full council a little later, though, and we'll see how that goes. Again, with it having broken, it's going to look vindictive. It's an unnecessary policy. They're trying to legislate courtesy. I mean, what they're saying is, and it's true, nobody should go into a neighbor's constituency and try to undercut the incumbent councillor or do anything belligerent like that. But it's not the role of the city to govern these things. It's communications between a candidate.
When I was in the legislature, if I went to another constituency, particularly rural ones where the MLA action might matter, I would make a courtesy call, even if it was NDP, particularly if it was another Wild Rose. But PCs, well, it wasn't many rural PC ridings, but I would make a courtesy call most of the time, unless it was something like a big event. If there was a convention center holding something where it's not really a constituency event, just happens to be there. I wouldn't do that, but it would be a courtesy thing. But it'd be the NDP half the time would do so for me. A health minister is coming to my riding to announce funding for the Strathmore Hospital or something. They would half the time let me know, half the time not. But it's a courtesy. You can't write this in a code of ethics, which effectively has the force of sort of law within the council or within a legislature. It's pretty transparent, I think, what this is about.
Yes, absolutely. And as I framed it, it was the anti-Farkas bill. I mean, it's purely targeted at him. There was no need for this. There wasn't a problem with this. And part of what they're saying is, well, it's not necessarily permission. There's a lot of things he can do. He just needs to inform the other. Well, yeah, one of those clauses talks about campaigning. And somebody campaigning in another ward has to give basically their whole campaign plan to the incumbent councillor before they do that. Now, there was a past campaign I'd been around once before I'd heard about, and they'd gotten a hold of the door knocking schedule of an opponent. So what happened was, of course, they door knocked 3 hours ahead of the opponent all the time. And it was quite disheartening for the opponent to always show up at a door that's already just been knocked and the lawn signs are already all placed ahead of them.
I did that in 2015 against the PCs.
Either way, there's things like that where they give actually quite an advantage to somebody who doesn't care for your campaign if you're going to give out your whole schedule and things like that. It's just not information that should be forced to be given to anybody else. It's not serving a purpose aside from hindering a mayoral candidate that they do not like. It blew up on them yesterday, and hopefully this stays live and blows up on them when they throw it before the whole council and just throw it aside.
And holy cow, did Councillor Giancarlo not very happy with our coverage, is he?
What was the term he used?
He took great umbrage with our coverage, and please go to the website and read the story and come up with your own opinion. But I think he calls it
weaponized.
Weaponized news. I don't even know what that means.
Well, I don't know, but I think we should make it the new slogan of the Western Standard. Instead of the new voice, the voice of the New West, independent voice of the New West, I think we're just going to say weaponized news.
Absolutely.
We'll change our logo, put some crossed rifles on it and something.
If exposing what their actions are is weaponizing, then let's carry on with it. It was just reporting. And again, the goal was, this was weaponized policy that people like Carra and Sutherland were putting through. And they were hoping it would slide under the radar without anybody noticing. As usual, they would beat down Jeromy in the House.
Sounds like a good follow-up column on the way.
And unfortunately, it became exposed. They would look petty and small if they put it through, so they backed off for now.
Well, actually, and on this, we're going to have a column coming out from Alex McCall. We're going to post it probably as soon as we're off the air here. So be sure to check out the Western Standard, follow our social media channels to be able to see that. We're going to be following this story as it develops, see what the city council itself does. Dave Naylor will be on the beat. But we want to thank all of you for joining us here today. If you're a Western Standard member, thank you very much for your support. We've had a real outpouring and growth of membership the last few months. If you support the Western Standard, if you support what we're doing, enjoy it, perhaps are even entertained by us from time to time, please consider becoming a member. Go to westernstandardonline.com, go to the membership section. For a couple bucks a month, you can help support having a genuinely independent Western media outlet that refuses to accept any government subsidies. Thank you very much for joining us here today. It's been a real pleasure. I'm Derek Fildebrandt, publisher, Dave Naylor, news editor, Cory Morgan, podcast editor and columnist. Thank you very much. Have a good day.